Hello and welcome to the Story Spark channel. Thank you for joining us today. Wendy, are the kids okay? Sarah, yes, they in #039, refine. Emily's keeping an eye on them. When I left, they were sound asleep. Wendy, did you ask her about the money for bail? Sarah, the police said it would be around $50,000, but you'll get it back once the charges are dropped. Wendy, About that. Emily asked why Mark isn't paying, and I have to say, I'm curious too. Sarah, well, I'm hoping this will all be resolved before Mark gets back in 2 days. Honestly, it's all a misunderstanding. Once Liam wakes up, he'll clear everything up, and the charges will be dropped. There's no need to stress Mark out. Wendy, who's Liam? I think you'd better start your little story from the very beginning, don't you think? A disheveled woman sat on the other side of the interrogation room bars, looking uncomfortable. She mentally braced herself for the upcoming conversation. In recent days, she had thought a lot about confiding in her husband, Mark, but now, with no one else to turn to, she had to shed light on what she had done. It felt dirty, even selfish, but she had to lay it all out to get her sister's help and avoid having this conversation with Mark. Breaking eye contact, Sarah began her story. Sarah, Liam is my work husband. Wendy, what the hell is a work husband? Sarah, oh, Wendy, you've always been a bit behind the times. These days, it's trendy. Many women in my office have work husbands. Wendy, I'll ask again, what the hell is a work husband? Sarah, sigh. It's just a distraction, a way to relieve stress or boredom at work. A guy in the office gets close to one of the girls, and at work, they act like husband and wife. Wendy, how much like a husband and wife? Sarah, you know, we look out for each other. Tell him when his fly's down, cheer him up when he's feeling down, go to lunch together, things like that. Wendy, and what about the more popular things husbands and wives do? Sarah hesitated. Could she avoid telling her sister more? No, she concluded. The rest of the story couldn't be kept secret. Without full disclosure, none of this would make sense. She mentally prepared herself for the inevitable judgment. Sarah, well, yeah. Sometimes it's just sex during work hours. Or pretending we're working late and doing it in the office after everyone's left. But it only happened 4 or 5 times. Mostly, it was just in a motel room across the street during extended lunch breaks. Saying it out loud, Sarah began to realize how pathetic her reasoning sounded. She avoided looking Wendy in the eyes and fell silent. Wendy, and this time, it wasn't an extended lunch break or working late. You called me after midnight. Let me guess, Mark was out of town on a business trip, wasn't he? So, this was a case of lying to your sister to get her to babysit your kids while you spent the whole night with your so-called work husband, wasn't it? Sarah's downward glance was the only response Wendy needed. Wendy, and how many times have I had to watch your kids while you were betraying your husband? I'm not happy about being made an accomplice, you know. Sarah, I swear, Wendy, it was the first time. Honestly. Wendy, if I had to place a bet, I'd still consider you truthful by nature. But why, sis? Is this the first time his wife has been away? Sarah, no, he's not married. Wendy, well, then everything's fine. At least he's not committing adultery. Relieved that the worst seemed to be over, Sarah let her sister's sarcasm slide and answered without hesitation. Sarah, no, he's a decent guy. He'd never do something like that. Sarah's brain finally caught up with her mouth, and her face turned beet red. Wendy just looked at her younger sister and shook her head, thinking once again about how their parents had spoiled their youngest child. Wendy, and what about your husband? What about Mark? What are you going to say when it's him sitting across from you, not me? For a moment, Sarah panicked. Sarah, I told you, if you get me out of here in the morning, Liam will wake up and tell the police what really happened. Then Mark will never have to find out. Unless, of course, I tell him. Wendy, or Emily. If you do this, the potential collapse of my family will be on your shoulders. The kids will be left without a father because of you. Sarah looked defiantly at Wendy, who stared back in disbelief. She knew her younger sister had always struggled to take responsibility for her mistakes, but this was ridiculous. Wendy, fine, you're wrong, Sarah. But even if Emily and I don't say anything, Mark will catch you eventually. In the end, cheaters always get caught. What was your plan if he finds out? Sarah, I hadn't even thought about it until one evening last week when Mark almost caught Liam and me. Wendy, what happened? Sarah, I called Mark and told him he'd have to make dinner for the kids because I was working late. But it wasn't work, was it? Wendy already knew the answer but couldn't hide her disappointment in her younger sister. Sarah, however, didn't notice a thing. Sarah, no, the office was empty, and the front door to the building was locked. But that damn cleaning lady let Mark in. The stupid fool, he brought me dinner. Luckily, Liam had just finished, well, you know. Thankfully, I had the sense to lock my office door. When Mark knocked, I had to hold myself together to keep anything from dripping onto the floor. Liam and I got ourselves presentable in record time, and I opened the door. Lucky Mark is so naive that he bought our story about the door accidentally locking. Wendy flinched and just shook her head. Wendy, so, after your brilliant evasion, what was your clever plan in case Mark actually caught you? Sarah, well, according to my friend Jen, I don't need to do anything. If Mark kicks me out, I'll get everything: custody of the kids, the house, alimony. Apparently, as long as the mother isn't in prison, she gets it all. My plan was simply to point that out to Mark because then he'd never leave me. He lives for the kids. Both of them reflected on the well-known tragic story of Mark's first marriage and ambush by his wife and her lover, a lawyer who fabricated accusations of physical abuse, allowing his ex-wife to secure a full restraining order. Constant whispers in the children's ears until they eventually refused to speak to their father, even over the phone. Wendy had tears in her eyes as she sympathized with Mark's hopeless situation. She felt ashamed to be related to Sarah. How could Sarah even think of doing something like that to her husband? Wendy, you're right, Sarah. It will destroy him if he has to go through this again. Sarah, exactly. Wendy stared at the despicable creature her sister had become and felt an overwhelming urge to wipe that smirk off her face. Wendy, then again, you never know for sure. Mark is smart. He might come up with a solution that will catch you off guard. Sarah, no, Wendy. The worst thing that could happen is that I lose Mark but gain everything else. Wendy, if Mark throws you out, you can always sleep with Liam. Sarah, not after what that scumbag did to me. I can't believe they're accusing me of assault. I was just defending myself. That idiot took advantage of me. Wendy, what? Your work husband took advantage of you? Well, coercion in relationships is quite a hot topic right now. All right, Sarah, tell me the rest. You said he was a decent guy. So, how exactly did a decent man end up doing that to you? Wendy's sarcasm went unnoticed by Sarah. She paused for a moment before deciding to tell her sister the whole dirty story, no matter how awkward it might be. Sarah, well, as I already said, I never had a full night with Liam before, just a few episodes at the motel and a couple of quickies in the office. So, when Mark said he was going out of town for 3 days, I jumped at the chance to see what Liam was really like. Wendy rolled her eyes, but Sarah ignored her. Sarah, I dropped the kids off at your place, had dinner with Liam, and then called Mark like I always do when he's away. Wendy, how do you do it, Sarah? Sarah, do what? Wendy, talk to your husband as if nothing is happening. Only Sarah knew the inner demons she faced in the early stages of her office romance with Liam. However, those torturous moments of guilt quickly faded, replaced by the realization that Mark was easy to deceive because he trusted her. She chose to treat her sister's question as rhetorical and ignored it. Sarah, after I managed to speak with Mark before he asked to talk to the kids, Liam, and I got to it. I have to admit, it was a bit of a disappointment. At the motel, it was rushed, different and fun. When we did it over the desk at work, it was cliché but thrilling. I suppose I had built up the night in my head, and reality just couldn't compete. It felt routine and, dare I say, a bit boring. Liam isn't really into foreplay. I barely had time to think about it before he was on me for the first time. When it was over, he rolled over and fell asleep. He'd already drunk almost an entire bottle of wine at dinner. I dozed off briefly but woke up with a restless desire. I woke him up by, well, you know. Sarah stopped mid-sentence, noticing her sister's expression. Sarah, sorry, you're right. You don't need all the details, do you? Anyway, once he was ready, I didn't want to repeat the same mistake, so I got on top of him. But he told me I needed to take a shower first. I hadn't even gotten the water to the right temperature when Liam joined me, and suddenly, all the lights went out. He told me the house was old, and the fuses kept tripping. He left, and I heard him fumbling with the bedroom door handle. I thought he was grabbing a flashlight from somewhere and would fix the fuse before coming back to the shower. I waited almost 10 minutes, but he never returned. I called out to him and thought I heard him shout from the bedroom that he was waiting for me in bed. I wondered why he hadn't fixed the fuse, lit a candle, or done something. It was still pitch dark. I turned off the water and called out, but there was no response. I couldn't understand why he was being so irritating. I fumbled around until I found a towel, shouting that I was getting dressed and going home, but my clothes were still in the bedroom. Wendy yawned. It was already very late, and Sarah's words and behavior contradicted her earlier claim about coercion in the relationship. Besides, the story was becoming dull. Sarah, I felt my way to the bedroom, thinking I'd find the bed by touch. I knew my clothes were on the floor between the bed and the door. Suddenly, Liam grabbed me from behind and shoved me forward. I fell onto the bed. The next thing I remember, his hands were lifting me by the hips, and I could feel him against me. Mark and I sometimes acted out a forced scenario, it's my fantasy, so I decided to go along with it and relax a little. Sarah's cheeks grew warm, and knowing she had blushed after confessing one of her fantasies to her sister, she squirmed and lowered her gaze to her hands, absently watching as they twisted the rings on her fingers. Sarah, anyway, I felt one of his hands move away from my hip, and a moment later, I noticed something cold being applied. I told Liam he didn't need any of that, as I was already ready. I have to admit, the situation was intense. When I felt his hand adjust my position, I shifted to make it easier for him. Sarah paused, clearly uneasy, lost in her thoughts for a few moments. Wendy yawned again, just wishing this uncomfortable and upsetting story would come to an end. Sarah, and then, without any warning, he shifted in a way that caught me off guard. It was painful, Wendy. Really painful. Even now, it still bothers me. Sarah fell silent, shifting uncomfortably in her chair and frowning in pain. The memory of the pain washed over her again, not just the physical pain but also the sudden realization that someone she thought genuinely cared about her could treat her like that. Wendy, what did you do? Sarah, well, I yelled at him sharply. Wendy, and what did he do? Sarah, he just held me tightly and kept going. Damn it, it hurt so much. Wendy, and how did it end? Sarah, at some point, that idiot must have loosened his grip, which allowed me to break free. I scrambled across the bed. When I did, my hands felt something strange. Let me backtrack a little. When I first entered Liam's bedroom, there was a baseball bat leaning against the wall near the bed. I asked him about it, and he said there had been a few home invasions in the neighborhood recently, and he wanted to be prepared. Somehow, it ended up on the bed. Now that I think about it, it seems odd. For a moment, Sarah's face took on a strange expression. Sarah, do you think Liam was planning to use it on me if he couldn't overpower me? Wendy watched Sarah's face as she began to grasp the true nature of her work husband's intentions and how much worse the situation could have been. The color drained from Sarah's face, and she fell silent, prompting Wendy to suggest she continue. Wendy, and what happened next? Sarah, well, I grabbed the bat with both hands. I turned around and swung it as hard as I could. I felt the impact and heard Liam scream in pain. It was still dark, but I ran back to the bathroom as quickly as possible. I closed the door and fumbled around for the lock until I found it. Oh, Wendy, it was so terrifying. I could hear Liam trying to unlock the door and pounding on it. I knew it wouldn't hold him for long, so I felt around for a window but couldn't figure out how to open it. My foot bumped into a trash can on the floor, so I grabbed it and smashed the window. Then I started screaming and yelling. I saw lights come on in the house next door, so I kept shouting for help and calling for the police. Sarah trembled as she recalled the fear she felt during that moment. Wendy, and what did Liam do? Sarah, I don't know, but he stopped trying to get into the bathroom. I waited for 5 or 10 minutes, and although everything was quiet, I was too scared to open the door. Then I heard the siren of a police car. The next thing I remember is a police officer shouting for me to open the door. I did, and I stepped out. There were 2 of them with flashlights and guns. I was completely naked, so they could see I wasn't a threat, and there was no sign of Liam. I was terrified and ran downstairs. One of the officers followed me while the other stayed in the bedroom. Shortly after, I heard him shouting into his radio, calling for an ambulance. I told the officer with me that I didn't need one. He went back upstairs, grabbed my clothes, and I got dressed. He then led me to the police car and started asking me a bunch of questions. I told him how Liam had taken advantage of me and how I had hit him. They took me to the hospital, where they ran some tests, and then brought me here. They took my official statement and then asked if I needed a lawyer. Of course, I said no. Then they charged me with assaulting Liam and took my fingerprints. They found Liam unconscious near the bed. After that, they told me they'd hold me here until tomorrow's bail hearing. Naturally, I couldn't call Mark, so I called you. Sarah looked at her sister pleadingly, hoping Wendy would help her feel less alone and confused. Wendy considered finding a police officer and asking why her sister had been charged in what seemed like an obvious case of self-defense. Nevertheless, her sister's pitiful state tugged at Wendy. Sarah always had a talent for making others take care of her, and Wendy felt she shouldn't leave Sarah on her own. Wendy, I really don't understand how you're planning to keep Mark in the loop about all this. What's your plan? Sarah, well, once Liam regains consciousness, they'll tell them I only hit him in self-defense, and they'll drop the assault charges. Wendy looked at her naive sister with pity. She knew that for Sarah to be exonerated, Liam would have to admit to coercion in the relationship, and while Wendy didn't know the man, someone who seduced a married woman was unlikely to be that noble. She was spared the agonizing task of explaining this to her desperate sister when a plainclothes detective entered the room and asked her to leave. After Wendy left, the detective settled into the vacant chair and alternated between looking at Sarah and reading her statement. Sarah tried to read his expression, hoping Liam had told the truth. Finally, the detective set the document aside and addressed the hopeful woman. Detective, so, let me clarify, Mrs. Brown. For several months, you've been having an illicit affair with your work husband behind your husband's back. On the evening your husband was out of town, you decided to spend the night at your lover's house. During sex, you interrupted to take a shower, at which point the power went out. When your lover did not return, you returned to the bedroom, where you claim he attacked you and used force. You then found a baseball bat on the bed and hit him once. Is that correct? Sarah, yes, I've already told you everything. Has Liam regained consciousness? He needs to confirm that everything I said is true. Detective, no, I'm afraid he hasn't regained consciousness. In fact, it's my duty to inform you that you've gone from being a workwife to a work widow. Mr. Liam Smith died without regaining consciousness after being found on the bedroom floor between the bed and the wall with severe multiple head injuries. Doctors say he was struck up to 7 times, mostly while he was lying on the floor, likely unconscious. The baseball bat found at the scene had fingerprints on it, yours and the deceased's. Sarah Brown, you are being charged with second-degree murder. I remind you that you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. At that moment, Sarah fainted. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We'll see you in the next episode of Story Spark. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye, end quote.